Mini episode 444 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.info.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode number 444. You have two FDH Lounge original dignitaries with you today. It is I, managing partner Rick Morris, along with our senior editor Jason Jones. And you know, the number 444, Jason, when it comes to mind, you know, it's pretty momentous. The hostages were released from Iran on the 444th day of captivity. I can't promise that anything that big will be happening here. Wait, I'm lying. I can. We are unveiling our 2014 top 32 player in the NFL list, which has become an annual tradition. And for the second year now, we are recording an evaluation of it. Jason, you will be evaluating the list that I was in charge of curating here, where you agree, where you disagree on this list. And again, this will be a very momentous occasion for us here today to get to break this down, talk some hardcore football.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this, up to my eyeballs in training camp stuff. So this is all good. It's another domino falls towards the regular season. So
yes,
very excited.
Yes, another thing to mark us along the way towards opening day of the football season. Just to recap a little bit here, we did earlier in the summer our top 30 players in the NBA, top 30 players in the NHL. This one's 32. Why? There's 32 players in the NFL. We just came up with it originally as an average of one per team. Now, 32 players in the NFL doesn't really do you justice. 30 in the NBA, we were kind of stretching there towards the end. You're talking borderline all-star at best. You got Pro Bowl caliber guys right up and down this list. This is probably, I would say, the toughest one to do. The MLB list, which I'll be recording shortly with Steve Callis, that one's tough because it's in season, and it's hard to get a read on guys, and you've got guys falling out like Jose Fernandez, who would have been on the list and would have been very high, actually, but ends up getting dropped. Same thing here. We do have some players who are injured and or unavailable for much or all of this year. We'll get to that in a moment. But essentially, again, the criteria on all of these lists, it's a snapshot in time. If you were starting a franchise, what would be your preference going from 1 to 32 down this list? And so we start from that perspective. 3 guys who would have been on the list, who were on the original top 32 and it started to be formed some months ago, but are dropped. The first 2 because of injury, Kiko Alonso, Navarro Bowman, and Josh Gordon being dropped because of the likelihood of a suspension for some, if not all, of the upcoming season. So let's talk about that in a second here, as well as the guys who were dropped from last year. There's always quite a churn on this list because, again, the NFL top 32 is so hard to make. From a year ago, and you'll recognize that some of these are because of injury, and some of these were tougher calls, frankly, to drop than other guys. But Rob Gronkowski, 29, an obvious injury case right there. Chris Johnson, 28, maybe hitting the wall a little bit. Eli Manning, 27, wasn't really his best self last year. Ben Roethlisberger, 26, again, not really getting it done as much, especially in terms of wins and losses, which was always more his forte than stats anyways. Clay Matthews, 25, the guy who I think is still on the borderline for this list. Jason Pierre-Paul, 23, a guy who kind of dropped off a little bit last year. Julio Jones, 21, close to making the list again, but a little bit of an injury concern. Roddy White, 19, some real concerns based on his play last year. Ray Rice, 17, enough said about him. Patrick Wells, 15, a tough call on missing the list this year. Arian Foster, 14, again, coming off an injury. We'll see how he performs. Back surgery is always an iffy thing. Joe Flacco, 13. Clearly, I had him slotted at the high water mark of his career last year. DeMarcus Ware, 12, falling off a little bit in Dallas. That was part of the reason they cut him along with salary concerns. Darrelle Revis, 10, a guy who was, again, pretty close to making the list this year. And Cameron Wake, 9. I would say ditto. So Your thoughts on these guys who didn't make the list this year, Jason?
First, although I accept that we don't have time in today's program to hit this to the level that I'd like to, I'm really holding out hope that the Josh Gordon thing isn't as dire as it may seem, and I am on board as being absolutely against every part of it. We'll save that for another day, though. As we look through the guys that sort of didn't make the list from last year, one theme sort of stands out to me, and that is I don't think a lot of these guys are done. Now, we're talking about a snapshot in time, and that's fine. But some guys, for instance, Chris Johnson, you can make the argument that maybe we've seen the best we're going to see from Chris Johnson. He may never get back to a place where we're saying he's one of the top 32 players in the league. However, I don't think that's the norm with this list. Cameron Wake, Darrelle Revis, DeMarcus Ware, Arian Foster, Patrick Willis, Ray Rice, Julio Jones, Jason Pierre-Paul, Clay Matthews. I think all of those guys just had a bad year, or there was a regression in their production, or it was an injury thing. By no means should be considered a slight against them going forward. Gronkowski, I'm pretty close to saying boy who cried wolf on that one. He's a great talent, great at his position, especially how it fits in with the Patriots, but the guy seems to get injured every other week, so he may not get back. But the funny thing here is that especially Clay Matthews, I'd like to say Julio Jones, Patrick Willis, Arian Foster, Ware and Revis especially, are all players that I think we think of in that elite stature. Not really good, but exceptional potential Hall of Famer types. So to see them off the list is it causes you to make a double take, but I think there's good reason for why they're not on the list, and I think a good portion of those guys might find themselves back on the list this time next year.
And that's the nature of the beast. I don't think you get as much churn back and forth with the NFL as you do some of these other ones. You get a lot of guys falling off. Generally, I think replaced by newcomers as I think back to the last couple of years. But you do get, of course, some guys bouncing back on, even if it's not as much as you get in the NBA and the MLB and some of these other ones. So, again, yeah, I think a lot of these guys, Julio Jones to be sure, if he comes back and performs as has been the norm for his career, he'll be back on the list and pretty high next year, maybe even in the top half of it. And it's funny, Jason, because there's going to be a guy coming once we start the list here where I was shocked that he didn't make the list last year. It shows you how competitive it is just to make this, to be one of the top 32 players in the world at any given point in time. So with that having been said, let's start looking at the second tier. And we have at 32 and 31 both of the offensive tackles that are represented on this list. And again, that's another thing that makes football so tough relative to the other sports here. Apples and oranges as far as greatness at positions and how it's measured, how you measure offensive line talent in general. I mean, if they're not allowing their quarterback to get murdered, that's an obvious plus. And if you're shutting down great edge rushers and you're a tackle, that's obviously a big point in your favor. But we have, starting the list at 32, Joe Thomas, who was not on the list last year. At 31, Joe Staley. He was 24th a year ago. The guy that I referenced that I was shocked missed the list last year, Ndamukong Suh, at 30. And, again, just ahead of him, and it just shows you what an eclectic list it is. At 29, Nick Foles, a guy who would have been nowhere on the radar last year, wasn't even the starting quarterback in Philly at the start of the year. Questions remain as to how sustainable his success is, and he'll probably never have an insane touchdown-to-interception ratio like that again, but it's the kind of year that he had. You got to look at it. You got to take it into consideration. 28, Luke Kuechly down in Carolina, one of the great inside linebackers in the game at this point in time. 27, Keenan Allen, a guy that we talked about a little bit off air, a wide receiver who put up some very un-rookie-like numbers a year ago. Not quite, as you pointed out to me, at the level of Randy Moss, who was sort of the standard bearer of that all-time for rookies, but well above average for a rookie and very promising. 26, Cam Newton, also not on the list last year, just like Allen, Kuechly, and Foles. And 25, topping out the second tier, Robert Mathis. This has to do with, again, the fact that he's available for 12 games this year. He's a guy that I had as borderline top 5 with the explosive year that he had a year ago. in Indianapolis. I had him even ahead of Andrew Luck on this list, but he is no better than the second best Indianapolis Colt based on his availability and not being there for the first 4 games of the season. So starts, thoughts on the list, Jason, the second tier?
Going in a similar reverse order here, if I can nitpick a little bit, I'd probably flip Joe Thomas and Joe Staley, call it a bias, but I get the impression, at least from me, that Joe Thomas is everything. He's everything that was touted when he came out. And if you'll recall, I was very much against that selection at the time. But the fact of the matter is he's quiet. He does his job. I couldn't even tell you the last time he was just beaten. Whereas Joe Staley doesn't stand out as much to me. But then again, we're talking about tackles, and if they're doing the job, you're not hearing the name anyway. So that might just be a bias creeping in, but I'd be inclined to say Joe Thomas is probably slightly ahead of Staley. Sue not being on the list last year is intriguing, but I can see that he's probably right where he should be this time around. The Nick Foles thing, I think you have to, as you've done, sort of lay out the preface that he may not finish his career, with like a 10-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. But for the time that we're gauging this from, Nick Foles was remarkable, and you can't leave him off this list. Here's where we get a little tricky, though. Luke Kuechly, who I would say, if everyone's healthy, all things considered, is still probably at worst the second best inside linebacker or middle linebacker in the whole NFL. The question is, where do you value that position? I would be inclined to say, if I was making one of these lists, just shooting from the hip, that I would have Kuechly at least in the teens. Now, that said, you have to make the list. You go back through, and the question is, who are you bumping down in order to put Kuechly up there? And as we get into the teens, I think we'll have that conversation. But my first impression is he might be a little bit low. Keenan Allen, as residing in the AFC West over here, I have a fair opportunity to watch the games. And the thing is that Keenan Allen never really wowed me, but I've been known to over-embellish the wrong details before. So we'll see what happens with him. Cam Newton, I guess, is right where he should be. I think the problem with Cam is everyone expected him to be much higher. We're still waiting for Cam Newton to basically take over the league, and at this point, I don't know if we're going to see that. He may be who we think he is, and that could be in the mid to late 20s of a list like this. And then Robert Mathis is, like a lot of these players, it's too bad that we have to base this on the eligible games he's got to play. And again, the commissioner and the league are driving people like me insane with the punishments and the inverse nature of them. I would say that if he's playing all 16 games and everything being equal, Robert Mathis has to be in the top 10 based on what he did last year alone. And I think that would have been the case.
I agree. As I recall, I had him somewhere plus or minus top 5. I had him way up there. The interesting and funny thing to me is how interchangeable it kind of was. Him and Robert Quinn, two edge rushers named Robert from the Midwest playing in domed stadiums, and it was a matter of which one do you like more. And Quinn is way up the list. So that tells you, what we both think of him here. And an interesting thing as well, too, in terms of Joe Staley, is that, again, if you're a left tackle, the first thing we kind of key in on is pass blocking, how you hold off the dominant edge rusher who's going to get put on you from the other team. One of the things also, too, is that I think this was kind of given a little bit of credence in his case, something that it was tough to measure Joe Thomas on because the Browns had one of the worst running games in the history of the league last year after trading Trent Richardson. But Joe Staley, I give him a lot of credit for continuing to prop up Frank Gore as a top-flight NFL running back with the amount of city miles, quite frankly, that are on that chassis. So I think that was one of the things that played into Staley's favor as well there. So that's one of the things that really makes it interesting, Jason. There's just so many different criteria to go back and forth on how we rate these guys.
And what you've just done is something that needs to be shared in all circles among the sports debating community. It seems like we are in a place right now where everyone is more concerned with being right, regardless of what that means. So in an effort to spread the wealth and hope that people get on board with this idea, I will say that based on what you just outlined, I am absolutely more than happy to reverse my position on the position of the Joes, because the running game is an interesting factor, and Cleveland, albeit not Joe Thomas's fault, we're putrid in that category, and it's not like we had anything that we can go on from that. And the converse being true with Frank Gore, absolutely. So I have no problem conceding to your point.
Okay, all right, interesting. I wasn't trying to win you over, but that was just something that popped into my head kind of when we were talking about that. And I was going back to, I guess, what some of the criteria were in my head. I was kind of revisiting that as we went along. That may not be the last time that happens to me here, where something pops into my head of what I was thinking about previously. But, the second tier goes from 25 to 32 on the list here. Really, I had a hard time separating out between 1 and 24. And I don't literally mean that 24 could have been 1 and vice versa, but just that the differences between one spot and the next were so sequential, it seemed to me. That's why the tier break was kind of low. If memory strikes me, I think that's how it was a year ago. Actually, I'm looking to see here. Second tier started at 26 a year ago, so this kind of tends to be the pattern with the list. So we'll next go in an increment from 24 to 15 and stop it there and just kind of break it down at that point. 24, we have the Skittles man himself, Marshawn Lynch, who is actually ending his holdout, coming in for Seattle. That would have probably dropped him to the second tier as well if there was any question about his availability for the entire 16-game slate. He was not on the list a year ago. 23, another gentleman who was not on the list a year ago, who I think is going to be a fixture. Actually, you could make the case for a number of the guys coming up that weren't on the list last year, but Patrick Peterson is going to have a lot of durability on lists like this in the years ahead. Witness the fact that he just got the biggest cornerback contract in the history of the NFL. Number 22, Vontaze Burfict. That's a guy that, again, was on the tip of our tongues when we were talking NFL draft when he came out. Actually was undrafted. So bad was his off-the-field reputation, but he has been a steal for the Cincinnati Bengals, every bit the playmaker that they would have hoped for, and again, more tackles than you can shake a stick at. He has just been insane. 21, Colin Kaepernick, up 10 spots from a year ago at 31, continuing to make great strides in San Francisco. Number 20, Demaryius Thomas, not on the list a year ago, but having the best season of any wide receiver not named Calvin Johnson a year ago, or Josh Gordon for that matter, but Demaryius Thomas right there as a slam dunk top 3 wide receiver in the league. Although I say slam dunk, and I do have a guy ahead of him here, so maybe I should reconsider that. A.J. Green has to be in that conversation as well. At number 19, he was 18 a year ago. Number 18 is Von Miller, Demaryius Thomas's teammate in Denver, down from 5 a year ago. Few more questions about him than there were a year ago, albeit still a very dominant player off the edge. Number 17, Jimmy Graham, not on the list a year ago. Number 16, LaShawn McCoy, exactly where he was a year ago, which may seem strange based on the fact that he had his best year ever last year, but maybe it just kind of tends to indicate that we saw it coming, and it kind of factored that into what his price would be, so to speak. Number 15, Geno Atkins, somebody who would be higher on the list as he was a year ago at 8, an absolutely unbelievable defensive stud, but a guy who's had 2 major injuries in the last 2 years here, not quite at the point of being called injury-prone, not quite Rob Gronkowski territory yet, but one more injury, and I think people are really going to be starting to shake their heads. That's why Geno is down at 15 and in this grouping as opposed to being higher. So, thoughts on the guys from 24 to 15, Jason?
Well, the first thing is the elephant in the room, and maybe I just need to watch more Seattle games. Maybe I need to not live in Denver or something, but I really do think that Marshawn Lynch is a little overrated. We're living in a different running back landscape right now, and I think there's a huge difference between Marshawn Lynch and, say, Peterson, Charles, and McCoy. I think he gets good, tough yards, but like Seattle, I'm not willing to rip up the contract and pay a huge premium for what he does, especially considering as a bitter viewer of the most recent Super Bowl, Marshawn Lynch didn't do anything. It seemed like the only game plan Denver executed well in that game was to shut down Lynch. So there's a part of me that wants to say that I think he's a little bit overrated. Who I would switch him out with, I don't know. But I'm fine with him being at the bottom of this tier. I'd be a little bit more upset if you had him in the teens. So that's fine.
Okay.
Patrick Peterson, on the other hand, I think is higher. I think it has nothing to do with the contract. And I've heard some rumblings that he is not going to be on kick return duty, and he's definitely not going to play offense, which kind of diminishes my ceiling for him. But my sort of thing is not to fuel the fire in the Twitterverse, but I really think wherever Richard Sherman is, Patrick Peterson can't be more than 5 spots behind, considering this is regardless of position situation. And that's just because I think Richard Sherman brings a whole other element to the position that Patrick Peterson has not developed yet, whereas Patrick Peterson has the athleticism to overcompensate. So I would have moved him up a little bit, but I have no real problem with where they are. Vontaze Burfict, I was banging the table for that guy on the draft. I remember saying something to the effect of, considering all the off-the-field issues, I don't see how you can let him go past the 3rd round. And he went undrafted. And granted, you always have this concern with people like him that either going to regress and have some sort of off-the-field issue that's going to result in loss of games or seasons. But the guy's been an absolute stud. I can't really speak to him off the field, but on the field, he's everything that he looked like he would have been coming out. Colin Kaepernick, I'm fine with where he is, but my thing with Kaepernick is he's got to hit another gear. He's got to get to the next level. He's got to show that he's not going to fall apart, and I'm not suggesting that he did. There seems to be something missing from Kaepernick, as considering where he is, as opposed to where we think he should be. But as for right now, he's fine where he is. The fantasy side of my brain wants to say there's no way on earth A.J. Green and Demaryius Thomas should be this far down the list. I think wherever they are, they should be almost side by side like you have them. But again, it's a question of if you want to move them up, who are you moving down? And then Von Miller. Von Miller is an interesting case. If Von Miller can get back to where he was 2 years ago, when they had Elvis Dumervil opposite him, which I think they're hoping is the case with DeMarcus Ware, maybe even better, I have no doubt that Von Miller is going to be in the top 10 next year. But Von Miller had to make up some ground after the suspension and then not exactly consistent play. So we'll see what happens there. Jimmy Graham absolutely needs to be on this list. Ware is absolutely up to the individual. If he was a very, very good blocker, I'd say he probably deserves to be 10 spots higher, but he's not. He is essentially, as much as he was trying to pull off this offseason, he is a glorified wide receiver. So he deserves to be on the list from what he's done statistically. But he's got to be a complete tight end to get too much higher than 17. LaShawn McCoy is interesting only because I think most people would say we have him way too low. I think LaShawn McCoy is a good running back, maybe even a great running back, that benefits from being in the right system with the right personnel. I'm not saying he's a system guy, but I am saying that if you put him in Pittsburgh, he's probably not the same player. But that's just a personal opinion. And then Geno Atkins has got to be my favorite defensive tackle that plays for a team that I don't care about. Geno Atkins, for being your typical 4-3 style defensive tackle, is nice. He's fun to watch. He's one of those guys like Warren Sapp was in his day that makes watching a defensive tackle actually fun to do. Whereas most of the time we just kind of accept that they're there and move on. So I would say with that section of Tier 1, I would move some guys around a little bit, but we're talking plus or minus 2 or 3 spots. I have no huge issue with anybody as of yet. But all of these guys in the second half of the top tier are absolutely guys anybody would want to have on their team, no question about it.
Sure, and I think we're probably past the point now, once we start at 14 and move up, of where I don't think you'll be questioning anybody on the list the rest of the way. I might be wrong about that, which would be entertaining, but my guess is the guys that are in the top 14 are probably good guys that you would have somewhere on the list. Something I want to put out there for you, see if this changes your mind any on the Marshawn Lynch point. I read an outstanding article this week on Grantland, as I have to say, in all fairness, they have so many great ones there. Robert Mays, who does great work there, and him citing some of these advanced statistics that, again, our boy Kyle Ross, FDH Lounge dignitary that I do so much football with, has really beat into my head the last couple of years, the advanced metrics out there and how important they are to really discerning the value of these guys. This is something that the Grantland article cites. According to Football Outsiders, Lynch led the league in broken tackles last year with 59, 8 more than anyone else. He had a broken tackle rate of 17.5% of his touches. That blew away, according to Grantland, every other back in the league who got significant work, and that Pro Football Focus, their rating only had Adrian Peterson as a harder running back to tackle. And that, again, he accounted for 29% of Seattle's offense. Adrian Peterson only accounted for 26% of Minnesota's. And we talked before about Joe Staley and about how the San Francisco line helps prop up Frank Gore, with all due respect to Frank Gore. The same is not true in Seattle, where the offensive line is really, for as great of a team as they are, the offensive line is really nothing special at this point. It's functional, it's serviceable, but they're not doing anything for Marshawn Lynch. So, just out of curiosity, does any of that turn you around at all on Marshawn Lynch's deservingness of being on this list?
It's intriguing, to be sure, because my gut would have said that when you're talking about all-purpose running backs and hard-nosed yards and all that stuff, that he would not be above Peterson. So that's something to take note of. And the offensive line is a consideration, because in every other offensive line on a team that has, let's say, a top 5 or top 10 running back, you're expecting to find at least a name you know, if not a few guys that put together make a nice unit. And Seattle doesn't have that, and anybody that thinks that I'm crazy, I dare you to recite the 5 starters for Seattle's offensive line. So I'd be intrigued to maybe reevaluate it, considering that. I would say that 24 is probably still the high water mark compared to the other guys on this list. But I would say that he deserves to be on the list. I'm just not sure where. And again, we're talking plus or minus 5 spots, so I might be talking about Marshawn Lynch at 26 and not 24. So,
absolutely, yeah. That's what makes this so fun, is all the different criteria that we can use, and the fact that, like snowflakes, no two viewpoints on these things are the same. But speaking of Seattle, Jason, this is about where this next segment is about to get a little bit more painful for you, because as we go from 14 to 6, you're going to be hearing a lot of guys from the Super Bowl champions. We actually start at number 14 with Cam Chancellor, who was not on the list a year ago. From there, J.J. Watt. At number 13, he was number 6 a year ago. At number 12, up from 32 last year, a dramatic jump for him, of course, Russell Wilson. Number 11 on the list, up marginally from 16 a year ago, Richard Sherman. At number 10, Andrew Luck. He was 30 a year ago. There's a lot of guys on your quarterback that just barely got in a year ago after their rookie year. Andrew Luck, Russell Wilson, and Colin Kaepernick, well, that wasn't Kaepernick's rookie year, but for all intents and purposes it was. It was the first year he played. They're all way up this year. Andrew Luck, the highest of those guys at number 10. At number 9, Earl Thomas, the highest-ranking member of the Seattle squad on this list, up from 22 a year ago. At number 8, it's Drew Brees. He was 7th a year ago, so more or less standing pat there. Number 7, Jamal Charles. He was 20th on the 2013 list, so a jump up last year with the great production that he had with an MVP caliber season for Kansas City. And at number 6 on the list, up from 11th a year ago, Tom Brady. And that may seem questionable to some, and particularly anyone that watched the AFC Championship game. A little bit of a narrative out there with, the guy's maybe not making some plays he would have made in the past. I keep coming back to this, though. Rarely, if ever, in his career has he had on paper a worse array of weapons, especially with the aforementioned unavailability a lot of the time of Rob Gronkowski. And statistically, he is still playing at a very, very high level, certainly higher than he was in the first half of his career when he was more of just a glorified Troy Aikman, a guy who won games but didn't put up the big numbers. But ever since Randy Moss got there, and ever since, Brady has continued to be a statistical machine and continues to be, even with guys right now that are pretty questionable compared to who he was working with earlier on in the last 7 to 8 years. So, thoughts on the guys from 14 to 6, Jason?
Let me just group the Seattle guys together, not necessarily in the way I would order them, but just for talking point purposes. Russell Wilson just continues to impress me within reason. I don't know that we're ever going to talk about Russell Wilson in the same breath as the top 4 quarterbacks, in my opinion, which in no particular order would be Peyton, Rodgers, Breeze, and Brady. I don't know that he'll ever get there, but for being excluded from that list, he just keeps finding ways to impress. Cam Chancellor is probably my favorite of the LOB, if you will. Richard Sherman cannot be denied. Whether you like him or you don't like him, he gets results. And then Earl Thomas. Earl Thomas is a big favorite of a lot of people. And whether it's just the culture they've got on that defense, he finds a way to the ball. He's a heavy hitter. I got no issues with that. But again, like the A.J. Green, Demaryius Thomas thing, I'd be inclined to put Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor in the same block, so to speak. Maybe not side by side, but really, really close. And you've got them 14-9, so it's not that far off. Stepping away from Seattle for a minute, if Andrew Luck cleans up the turnovers, he's got to be higher on the list. Now, that's a huge if, and he has yet to do it. He's had 2 seasons with, if I was a Colts fan, nerve-wrackingly high interceptions. But everything else is in line. So once he cleans that up, Andrew Luck could find himself up there in that top 4 when the top 4 move on. When Peyton Manning and Tom Brady retire, maybe there's room at the top for Andrew Luck. But we got to clean that up first. Drew Brees, phenomenal, and to your point on Tom Brady, which I will echo, Drew Brees is kind of similar, except without the regression in statistics. Drew Brees amazes me with what he can do with the personnel that he's given. And I don't mean to slight these guys, but Lance Moore, who's now in Pittsburgh, Marcus Colston, who hasn't lived up to expectation quite a while, and a series of bums and retreads and camp casualties. It doesn't matter who you give Drew Brees. He finds a way to put up ridiculous numbers, and for that absolutely deserves to be in the top 10. Jamal Charles is probably my favorite running back not named Adrian Peterson, and after having some conversations with people, I don't think that enough people paid attention to what Charles was doing, because if I've got the math right, and that's an if, I wouldn't bet the house on it. If I have the math right, Jamal Charles last year put up something ridiculous like 1,800 yards to 2,000 from scrimmage and like 19 combined touchdowns. I want to say it's 1,919. That cannot be disqualified for any reason. Jamal Charles is absolutely ridiculous, and in an offense that isn't all predicated on him exclusively, he's going to find ways to keep on trucking along. So love his position. And then the Tom Brady thing, like I said, I'll just echo your sentiments on this one. Whether you're looking at it from a fantasy perspective or just a wins and losses, real football perspective, you can't sleep on Tom Brady. I'm the first to say I cannot wait until the New England, dynasty or run or whatever you want to call it is over. I can't wait to have 2 seasons where the Patriots are sub 500 in a row. That will be awesome for me. But Tom Brady is incredible. Tom Brady, if you look at the players that he started the season with last year, you'd be like, no, it's not going to happen. Tom Brady would be lucky to throw 2,800 yards and 15 touchdowns because he's got no one. He's got a rec league flag football team out there as far as wide receivers go, and he finds a way to get it done. It may not be the 50-touchdown season that he set a few years back, but you got to give Tom Brady credit. He is remarkable, and he is a first-ballot Hall of Famer, and I don't even like the Patriots.
Well, something about Brady that I want to connect back to Seattle. I want to make 2 points about Seattle before we move on to the top 5. One is, as far as it goes with Tom Brady and Russell Wilson, I'm somebody who has kind of been buying into a little bit of the parallels between the two of them, especially earlier Tom Brady, where it was more that he was just a winner. He wasn't putting up the numbers. Russell Wilson may not ever wow you with the numbers because that doesn't appear to be the way that they're going, which is smart, I think. They're not putting all of the onus on him. They have a power rushing game, great defense, but they're getting him better weapons offensively. They're going to be opening it up more as we go along over a period of time. People want to compare him more to Drew Brees because of stature, but to me, he's more of the Brady type with the intangibles. Now, we'll have to see how that goes, and if he becomes, a slightly poor man's Tom Brady, which most people would probably anticipate, or if over the course of his career, if he can exceed the expectations and be on par with a Tom Brady, which, again, I think would probably be contrary to your expectations and a lot of people, Jason's. The other thing would be, and this would be incredibly nerdy if this ever happened, but I could see us doing this on this show. If we ever did a show about the greatest units of all time for a single season, greatest defensive line for this, greatest group of linebackers, the 45 Rams, and I'm just pulling it out of my ass, I don't know what the 45 Rams had, we would put the 2013 Seahawks secondary in there. One of the greatest performances by a unit in the history of football, bar none.
Yeah, and the sad thing is about that, from my perspective, was, living here, experiencing the season that the Broncos had, and going into it, I still felt, as of kickoff, that the Broncos were going to find a way to win. It would be a situation where offense outscores defense. And after that first play, the bad snap, I didn't feel so hot. And then I believe it was the second interception that Seattle got. It wasn't even halftime. And I remember thinking, no, this is it. You don't come back on a team like this from where they are. And that secondary is incredible. And, it's beautifully complementary, too. You've got Sherman, who's going to think his way to success. And then you've got guys like Cam Chancellor, who's like a linebacker back there. Earl Thomas flying everywhere. That secondary is incredible. So absolutely, it would go in a top unit regardless of era sort of list.
No question about that. We get to the top 5 of the list here, and as we talked about before, Robert Mathis would have been at least borderline for this, but again, he is 25 on the list and at the top of the second tier because of his suspension, the 4 games for taking whatever he needed to sex his wife properly, I guess, to have a baby. I guess is that the technical term? Suspended 4 games, sexing his wife AIDS. But so because of the stuff that
I don't remember where that was in the collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah.
You violated the sexing the wifey clause.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's exactly what Roger Goodell called it in the suspension hearing when they were going through it. But it is a shame for him because I was joking about it before, him and Robert Quinn being fairly interchangeable, but there you go. But Quinn is actually fourth on the list here. We'll start, we're looking at the top five. Down from one a year ago. He didn't have a bad year by any stretch of the imagination. It just wasn't an all-time historic year like the 2012 season was. So for Adrian Peterson, who didn't have the best season by a running back last year, that would have been either Shady McCoy or Jamal Charles. But again, taking into account body of work, he is still the number one running back on the list, albeit at number 5 this year. Robert Quinn is at number 4. He was not on the list a year ago, which seems incredible, but that was a great jump up for him last year. Calvin Johnson, Megatron, is third, exactly where he was a year ago on the list. Not his best year, a little bit injury dinged, but again, Megatron still the best in the league, no question. Number 2, Peyton Manning, up from 4th a year ago. We know about everything that he did, especially in the regular season there, and there is no reason to believe that there won't be similar output from him this year. Number 1, Aaron Rodgers, who again himself was dinged, missed a good part of the season last year. He was second on the list last year, but he moves up to first. I think part of it is, too, in looking at it and what he was able to do at the end, while clearly not 100%, that shows you his value, and Green Bay being an absolutely pathetic dog slop team in his absence, I think also proves his value. So he ascends to the top spot on the FDH Lounge, top 32 players in the NFL list for this year. So moving up from 5 to 1, Peterson, Quinn, Megatron, Manning, and Rodgers. Your thoughts, Jason?
You know, when I first looked at this, I felt like it was all out of whack. And the more I think about it, the more I'm okay with it. It's sad that we're talking about Adrian Peterson with roughly 1,400 yards and 11 touchdowns combined as being, kind of a letdown for his standard. And for that reason, I have no problem with him being where he is. The only thing I would say is, as an absolute Adrian Peterson apologist, homer, whatever you want to call it, the most I could give him would be to flip with Quinn, and that's really asking for a lot because Quinn was ridiculous last season. And then this is the way it's going to be probably for the foreseeable future. Is as long as Adrian Peterson's still productive and Calvin Johnson is still Megatron, I don't see how your top 5 could not include the top 2 quarterbacks, Adrian Peterson, Calvin Johnson, and someone else who stepped up huge, which is essentially what you've got. Naturally, you know who you're talking to, so I'm gonna probably say that I can make an excuse to leapfrog Peyton over Rodgers. With that said, though, there is something majestic about what unfolded last season with Green Bay. Because you take Aaron Rodgers out, and that team was the Bad News Bears almost. You put Aaron Rodgers back in, even when he wasn't healthy enough, he wasn't 100%. I think there was even a report saying that the doctor strongly recommended he wait another week. And then they flipped the light switch. Green Bay goes as Aaron Rodgers goes, which I think is a huge testament not only to where he is on this list, but ultimately how fast we put him in Canton. I mean, he's got the one Super Bowl. If they find a way to win another one, I think he's a lock, if he isn't already. And then the thing with Peyton Manning, and it's probably just a personal bias, I just think after the season they had, I'm really struggling trying to. Part of me wants to put Peyton at 1, and the other part says, yeah, but if you take Peyton away from the Broncos, they're probably still, an 8, 9, 10 win team. You take Aaron Rodgers away from Green Bay for 16 games, and they're picking in the top 10. So, the way Green Bay reacted makes me kind of think that maybe Aaron Rodgers needs to be where he is, even though Peyton Manning broke every offensive record in the book. So it's a huge but interesting thing to haggle over.
Yeah.
Calvin Johnson is still legit. Robert Quinn may be the next, whoever. So as far as the top 5 goes, we can bicker all we want about order, but I think the 5 guys in the top 5 are the 5 guys that need to be there.
And you're right, 4 of the top 5 guys were there a year ago. Robert Quinn is the only exception to that. Good pickup on your part there. Again, a prime caliber discussion here today, as I knew it would be. Thank you very much, Jason Jones, helping us break down the NFL Top 32.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, waitresses, strippers, bartenders, garbage men, janitors, microwave popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and the periodic table of elements.